right, welcome back to Psychedelics today, everybody. Today we are joined with Mike Margolies from Psychedelic Seminars. Welcome to the show, Mike. Glad to have you here.
Thanks, guys.
Cool. Yeah, we've been in communication for a while now, and you haven't been on the show yet, have you?
No, actually, somehow I've managed to not make an appearance yet.
Well, today's the day. Do you want to give the listeners a little bit of background about who you are really quickly?
Sure, yeah. How long of a version of the story do you want?
Your call, your preferred version.
I'll give a synopsis and feel free to dig in. But in a nutshell, my psychedelic origin story, if you will, is once upon a time I used to work as a chemical engineer in corporate America, and then I did ayahuasca. So I quit my job, spent a bunch of time on the road. And when I came back to the States, this is about 5 years ago now, and I was left with this question of, well, hey, what am I going to do with myself? I don't want to go back to that same life I was in. And I took a look around. I went back, at the time I was in Baltimore, which is my hometown. And took a look around and I saw the pulse of the country at that time. In between the time I had left the country in 2013 and got back in the end of 2014. So, in those 15 months, weed had been legalized in 2 states. I started looking around at the research that was not as far along as it is today or as known, but MAPS and Hopkins were doing. And it just occurred to me, okay, this is a subject I was passionate about already. And this was the time. And there wasn't anyone organizing locally in Baltimore. And so I kind of knew where I needed to begin. So I started Psychedelic Seminars, which at first was a local community in Baltimore. And I started organizing there, hosting monthly events, grew my community locally. Eventually, the community that I started in Baltimore was sort of, I left it in other people's hands and it became its own self-running thing, the Baltimore Psychedelic Society today, that now runs on its own without me. And I spent some time, for a while, I was working with Symposia, also founded the Crypto Psychedelic Summit a couple years ago, which was its own interesting adventure. And today I'm living in the Bay Area, and I've re-envisioned the Psychedelic Seminars project in the last couple of years. I was doing events in San Francisco, and also filming them and putting them out more globally. Different interviews with leaders in the psychedelic community. And today I'm actually pivoting the whole project to be entirely online based. The idea being events are great, and that's where a lot of my background is, and they take a lot of energy to do. And so the idea is by focusing on specifically online, could put out more content. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Sweet. So will this be like an online video type of podcast or kind of like the summit, or will you still be recording in person and just posting it online? Because I think your interview with Bill Richards was really awesome, in person kind of interview style. So
yeah, it'll be actually the interview I did with Bill Richards is kind of the prototype for what I'm going to do. So it's cool. It is kind of like a podcast style. It's a conversation like this. Also, but in the same room and with, and filmed. And what I'm doing with this is, doing professional recording, multiple cameras, doing a whole thing to make it really nice and releasing them for free online. The Bill Richards one it'll be more of that type. The next one I'm doing actually next week, I don't know when this episode will be posted, but filming on February 14th. An interview. Actually, I'm not doing the interview for the next one, but Izzy from MAPS is going to be interviewing Francois Borzat, who recently wrote a book, Consciousness Medicine, Indigenous Wisdom and Theogens and Expanded States of Consciousness for Healing and Growth, along with Eugenia Casimiro, who's a Mazatec healer. And we're going to feature the three of them. The three of them are going to have a conversation about kind of weaving the worlds of indigenous traditions along with Western psychotherapy.
Cool.
Yeah.
That sounds really exciting. Something I learned at the Kriya conference, I didn't know that Francois was in lineage of Maria Sabina. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, Maria Sabina to Julieta Casimiro to Eugenia Casimiro, who's Julieta's daughter, who we're going to be speaking with next week.
Cool.
Yeah, and so it's very cool. I think this will be an interesting conversation, and they're going to do it. It's going to be mostly in Spanish, and then we're going to translate it. But I think it'll be, there's a lot. We talk a lot in the community about, putting voice to indigenous traditions. It's a very difficult thing to do, though. It's for a number of reasons. One is a language barrier, but two is, what's in it for people from indigenous traditions. Why do they care? They're not as invested in coming to our conferences, speaking in these structures of the research, right? So it's a challenging thing to do, but I'm excited about being able to do it next week, and hopefully we'll be able to pull it off really well. And I think an important thing we want to hit on in this is like, what's the responsible way to do it? Because we don't want this to just be an extractive thing. Let's just draw from indigenous traditions the things that we like, but how do we engage with it in a way that has reciprocity? What's the responsible way to do it? So these are some of the themes that we're going to touch on in the conversation. As there's stuff that we have to offer as well. There are a lot of merits to the things we do up in the West, and how do we make this process more of an exchange,
like a collaboration in a sense,
yes.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How can we learn from each other?
Yeah, exactly.
It's always a hard conversation. I think the way you're approaching it sounds ideal, because I've not seen this conversation go well or be productive really in the past.
Yeah, I haven't either, and that's why I'm really excited to do it. It's a hard one to pull off. It's legitimately very difficult to do, but I think we have the right people for this and the right relationships in place, that we'll be able to do a good job with it. So I'm very excited about this one.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Is this going to be released online? There's no in-person element on that?
Yeah, so there's no live event here. We're going to film it in a private home, and release it online. And that's
awesome.
The direction the project in general is going to go. What I'd like to do is ramp this project up to the point where I can do one of these every month. Before I was do every single month a different one. The challenge for me now is, there's not ticket sales. I'm releasing it for free. There's no paywalls. It's all free. So the whole project is donation dependent now. So here's my plug. But so folks who, and the website, I don't know if we mentioned it yet, but it's psychsems.com, PSYCHSEMS. And if you like the type of content that I'm putting out on there, any contribution on Patreon, whether you can give $2 or $100 a month, is going to help us get there. Or we're also looking for higher level sponsors. We have MAPS as our nonprofit fiscal sponsor, meaning people can make tax deductible donations via MAPS. And so if anybody's interested to sponsor this and help us to create more of these, please do reach out at info@psychsems.com, and that'll be my plug.
Awesome. And so mainly you're plugging the Patreon for folks, or
that's probably the most
apps?
accessible way for people to help is the Patreon, which is patreon.com/psychsems. Or people listening do have more means. Very welcome. Would love to talk about sponsorship opportunities.
Sweet.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, once we can afford it, we'll let you know.
Thank you.
Cool. So in the past, we mentioned Bill Richards. You had a really fun one with Michael Pollan in the past. We chatted about that, I think, in New York around Horizons. The funniest part to me was like he was nonchalantly just kind of, expressing ADD, playing with the plant.
Right.
And he would like fill up your water cup. It was pretty fun. I was like, this is a really great recording, and it's so funny to just watch because he's got a mind, and sitting listening to other people talk, you gotta I don't know, I've got pretty bad ADD, so I gotta fiddle.
Right.
So I thought that was amazing, but it was still a great performance. And that was like a pretty packed room, right?
Yeah, that was the biggest event I've done. That was about 600 people. It's very easy to sell 600 tickets when you have someone with that name on it.
Right.
But yeah, that was for me personally actually a very big event, obviously. It was a big shift, it was the biggest thing I had done to date. And at the time I was, that was the relaunch. I had previously been putting a lot of my time into symposia and other projects, and after having left that, I was trying to figure out what's my new identity in the space, who am I, and so that sort of just came along at that time. So for me, it was really nice to have the opportunity to do that event and sort of relaunch myself out in a big way. And it was really cool. It was really fun interviewing him, and I tried to ask him deeper questions and tougher questions than he had been asked in the more, general media interviews. Since I'm coming from within this space and I know more of the nuance, I was able to dig a little bit deeper with them. And so it was nice to be able to really engage with them on that level, and also ask him the questions that the community was asking, and ask him directly.
Right. And I don't know that this is the time to go into those questions.
Sure.
But people should go check out that video. Is it on YouTube?
It's on YouTube. Yeah. And so all the videos are free on YouTube on the Psychedelic Seminars YouTube page. And you can find that all through psychsems.com.
Great. Yeah. We tried to get him to Denver and it was just too much money.
Yeah.
But it seemed like a cool opportunity, regardless.
Yeah, I got lucky. I was able to get him without the exorbitant fee.
Nice.
But I had built a relationship with him for many years. I met him actually at first in Baltimore, back when I was first starting to be involved. This was in like 2015. He was in Baltimore doing research for the book back in 2015, and I reached out. Somehow I was able to get in touch with him, and we grabbed a drink together on Halloween. I was dressed like the dude.
Nice.
But we stayed in contact for over the years, and so and then we were able to do that interview together. It was nice.
Yeah, that's awesome. And who else have you had on?
So after Pollen, the follow-up event was with Jim Fadiman and Ayelet Waldman, and that was all about microdosing. That's one of the more popular episodes that's been viewed the most online. We went into the benefits, not only the benefits, but also the risks of microdosing, which aren't necessarily as known. And also just generally, we talked about what's not known, because that's a big thing. There's just a lot of question marks around it. So we really dove into, I tried to give a whole picture of what microdosing is and what people should be aware of if they're going to do it. The conventional understanding is, psychedelics are pretty harmless, therefore taking less of it can't do any harmful. But it's not necessarily true. And so we got into that a little bit.
Right. It's interesting to see it, psychedelics framed as if they're some sort of like not powerful herbal supplement or something like echinacea.
Right.
Like echinacea is amazing, but it's like does not equal LSD or
and even microdosing, you can, it can increase anxiety. And just because there's not known physical harm from taking a large dose of LSD, it doesn't mean that taking a smaller dose regularly is safe. Because there's a different risk profile when you're doing it on a consistent basis versus, taking a big trip every once in a while. And there still needs to be more research on this. But the idea is we don't necessarily know that this is physically as safe just taking this, like a supplement.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and there's that whole kind of scare about the 5-HT2B receptor frequent use.
Exactly. Yeah, the concerns are on the 5-HT2B receptors on the heart. And it doesn't have to do with the dosage amount, but has to do with the frequency. So even at low dosage, if you're doing it every 3 days, that we don't know that activating the 2B receptors in the heart is actually a safe thing to do.
Right. And I think there's like some debate about that research. Like I forget who postulated that, but it was based off of
Yeah.
that medication fen-phen. Is that correct?
So there's
Yeah.
there's a paper, actually Hamilton Morris sent me this paper about it a while back, about this rat study. And that's one place where I saw this. There are definitely, I can't remember offhand what the critiques were. There definitely were questions around the science. So I don't think this is, we can't say firmly, yeah, this is dangerous. I think it's more so an open question though, that we don't
Right.
know it's safe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are definitely critiques of the current science and the current research about this though.
Right. Yeah. And when I was talking to Dr. Torsten Passy about his book, The Science of Microdosing, it brought up like a really interesting point about like, what is a microdose? And
Right.
are people actually microdosing, or are people usually just engaging in what would maybe be called a low dose? Right. So are people just taking low doses of psychedelics versus the actual definition of a microdose? Like, right. So like subperceptual, shouldn't be feeling anything, but people might be taking more of these lower doses where they feel a little bit of effect.
Yeah. I think the technical definition that Jim Fadiman uses is it's sub-visually perceptible. But yeah, I think
really he uses visual as opposed to like other feelings.
I have to.
I always say subperceptual
or subperceptual. Yeah, and so if it's a true microdose, it's but what do we mean when we say subperceptual? If we're still saying there's an effect I noticed on my mood, on my what have you, right? So that's a perceptible effect.
Right.
So and yeah, I think there's the threshold dose, which is one of my favorite sweet spots. The threshold dose is nice. It's like, it's just noticeable, barely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're all interesting places to explore around. Yeah, it's an interesting question though. And maybe what we call a microdose is just a dose, and what we call a dose is a megadose. We're overdosing ourselves. I think Hamilton has framed it this way, that we're calling it, we've just overdosed, and to the point where we're having these, experiences of ego death. Arguably that's an overdose.
Right. Like we were actually talking to our breathwork teachers the other day about like this term overdose and how it's just a really complicated term these days. Like It doesn't necessarily mean something. Kyle,
Right.
You had somebody kind of yelling from the audience recently, you can't overdose on LSD, or like something along those lines. And the term just doesn't have a good definition for us. Like clearly overdosing on opiates mean you die, or you get some naloxone and you don't die. Overdosing on LSD looks like me running around a festival shirtless with no shoes on for 10 hours, like. Right.
And so, or ketamine's a good example. If you do enough ketamine that you're in a K-hole, is that an overdose? Even if you didn't die, or, it depends on the setting. Like if you're doing ketamine in a therapeutic setting and you're intentionally taking a big dose because you want to go all the way, maybe it's maybe what's an overdose is different on setting versus, if you're at Burning Man and you took so much ketamine that you're just splayed out on the middle of the playa and catatonic, without the right context for it. So yeah, context dependent. What's an overdose?
I think that's the best way to frame it for sure. Because there's so many different contexts.
Yeah, because somebody
to a club to Burning Man to therapeutic and beyond, right? Mm-hmm. Like in anesthesia for surgery, I've probably had extraordinary doses of ketamine that I don't remember, unfortunately.
You've had ketamine for surgery.
Oh yeah, ketamine, fentanyl. I tell everybody I've had fentanyl. They freak out. It's like, don't worry, I paid full price. It's a funny thing, right? Because it's such a stigma, even though it's like quite medically relevant.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, all the opioids, they all have medical relevance. Heroin actually has very well documented medical use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's prescribable still.
Yeah, in other countries it is.
It's not prescribable here.
Not heroin, no.
Okay.
But it is in the UK. Yeah.
Right. Well, it doesn't mean we don't have drugs not very similar to it, right?
Oh yeah, we definitely have very similar drugs available. Extremely similar drugs. It's kind of arbitrary in a lot of ways. I mean, certainly there's different risk profiles for different things.
Absolutely.
But the idea that, I mean, that heroin is this drug with no medical use is not correct. There's definitely, it's important to acknowledge the risks for sure. And this is, now we're getting into like, broader drug policy beyond psychedelics. This is why it's important.
Psychedelics advocacy is a gateway drug to like larger drug policy.
Yes, to decriminalization of all drugs. And that's what I'd like to see. And that's an interesting topic too, because there's a lot of movement now, decriminalizing psilocybin or decriminalizing nature. And of course, I was here in Oakland when Decrim Nature passed. I was there at City Hall. That was a pretty far out experience actually. Because
what was that like?
Oh man. So there were just like lines of people coming up to tell city council their psychedelic stories. And it was just like the most surreal thing. It was just like, just person after person getting up and just telling city council, like, yeah, I did psychedelics. And it was just like, wow, this is times we're in now. People just like talk to city council about this. And then it passed unanimously and the whole, room just cheered. And it was amazing. It was really cool. And so it's really cool that it happened. And that said, I do wish that there had been a push maybe to do all drugs versus just these particular substances.
Can we unpack that for a little while?
Yeah, definitely.
It's highly political, and I get myself in trouble a lot talking about it.
Ooh. Yeah. Sure. What direction we want to go here?
Well, all right. Let's start with Decriminalized Nature's like kind of foundational theory, I guess, or foundational position, which is that nature should not be illegal, right?
Yeah, and that's not totally accurate of the position either, right? Because
let's hear it. What is it?
I mean, their position, if it really was about decriminalizing nature, poppy, for example.
I was going to ask, is opium decriminalized?
No, poppy is not included in decriminalized nature. So it's certain nature that's decriminalized. Also, it's not even really a decriminalization. It's an important thing to clarify.
Is it lowest priority, kind of like Denver?
Yeah, it's a deprioritization, similar to what Denver has. So on the books, this is still illegal. It's just now the lowest law enforcement priority, and there's not supposed to be funds allocated towards prosecuting these cases. But it's still illegal. It's still illegal on the state and federal level too, of course. So it's definitely a move in the right direction. It's definitely a signal. People should still, not be assuming that, oh yeah, it's totally fine. I can just, eat mushrooms in front of police now.
I'm going to grow whatever I want.
Right.
Yeah. Which we all want to grow whatever we want, right? But like, we should have that right. But
yeah, I think we should.
Framing it as a baby step is where I like to put it. It's like, yes, it's a step in the right direction, and it's the right time to push that. But it's really just like the beginning of a very long process of like cultural reform, largely. And like, what kind of critique do you like to say? Like, okay, so we could save a ton of lives by legalizing heroin. We could save a ton of money by legalizing LSD and probably MDMA. Or I like to say legalization, because I'm kind of a stick in the mud about decrim. Like decrim's for me a step in the right direction, but I would prefer to be able to buy LSD wherever I want from different vendors legally. That's just me. Other people like farm to table model where they can know the chemist.
Well, this is
the farmer's market.
Yeah.
Like, cool, but I don't necessarily have access to like chemists from California.
Right.
I have plenty of access to Walmart.
You get to that's where you get to a really interesting dilemma: the decriminalization versus legalization question. And certainly decriminalization, and I would take it a step further, as I was kind of alluding to where Decrim Nature has gone. I would make it decriminalize all drugs, and that's the question I'm asking a lot of the groups now. They're taking up Decrim Nature all around, and I'm asking them, okay, have you considered decriminalizing all drugs instead of just these drugs? And that's
where I get yelled at.
You get yelled at for that. Yeah.
Perhaps I'm not as sensitive, and I'm just like, hey, people are dying and people are going to jail forever for these minor infractions.
It's an easier sell, I think, today to decriminalize psychedelics because psychedelics are cool right now. They're hot. Everybody's read Pollen's book, so it's this cool thing, and it's easier to frame psychedelics in terms of the benefits. And it's a lot more difficult of a sell saying, hey, decriminalize heroin, because the relationship most people have with heroin is one of, okay, well, people are experiencing addiction, people are overdosing, and there are real risks to be acknowledged. And different drugs certainly have different risk profiles. I think the important thing here is just because you're not using criminal justice as your mechanism for reducing risks of drugs doesn't mean you do nothing.
Right.
And criminalization is not actually helping the situation, it's making it worse. So yes, we can acknowledge there's issues associated with heroin, with meth, etc. And let's do something about it.
Yeah.
Doing something about it, the last thing we want to do about it is add criminalization, add punishment, add penalties to people who are already suffering. Like it's very obviously, if really and truly our intentions are, we want to help people, we want to reduce the harm that drugs are doing to people, then our actions should be in the direction of reducing harm, not increasing harm.
Yeah.
And so that would be my shtick on why you decriminalize all drugs.
Right.
Mitch
It's like
Gomez always has the line, most drug war harms come from prohibition.
The vast majority of them do.
Yeah, that's kind of like my foundation. I like come back to that all the time. And, Carl Hart's clearly helpful.
And I think that he's driven a really important conversation. I really appreciated his talk at Horizons. I don't know if it's online yet, but if it is, you should definitely watch it. There's definitely.
And I hope it comes out soon. I haven't seen it yet. It's probably the most moving talk for me personally.
It was stuff that needed to be said. You know, and then, but so say we start with the decriminalization, we get to that next question then of a legalization or not. And I think that's for me where it gets dicey, because when we say legalization, what do we mean? Do we say, we say legalize and because when we've legalized and regulated cannabis, there's been a lot of problematic things around that.
Well, talk to me about that, because people say that all the time, and I don't, I live in Colorado. I've been dealing with it for quite a while. I was here when legalization happened, rec sales, and there was some shitty stuff, but overall it's way less shitty than people going to jail.
Sure. Definitely less.
I just don't necessarily understand the critiques of what's happened.
So, okay, I would frame it, if we start over and we're talking about what are laws for? Why are we doing this? What is regulation for? I think the way we've written regulation and licensing is completely reversed from the way it should be. So laws should be written in terms of what are you not allowed to do versus what are you allowed to do. In other words, I'm by default I'm allowed to walk down the sidewalk unless I punch somebody in the face, right? So I don't need to get a license in order to have the right to walk down the sidewalk. I have that right by default. So I think marijuana distribution should follow the exact same kind of thinking. So by default, everybody has the right to grow, buy, sell, whatever marijuana, unless you do something that is not allowed to do. You put these pesticides in your weed that we don't allow, right? But what we set it up instead is that actually no one's allowed to sell it unless you were granted this very special privilege of this license. And that licensing process ends up creating exacerbating a lot of the issues of the drug war itself. And so the communities that are most marginalized from the drug war in the first place continue to be marginalized in the supposedly post-prohibition world of cannabis. And
I wonder if we want to frame it again as baby steps, but I don't see anybody in Colorado being super active trying to go beyond it.
It's a baby.
We're kind of getting this crypto libertarian thing where government get out. Whereas a lot of people are super uncomfortable with that. I'm very comfortable with buying weed from whoever, or acid, unless, especially if I have a test kit, but you're right. The licensing thing, that's been a big problem for a long time. That's been a problem for probably well over 200 years in the West, probably more like 700 years. And it's you apply and then you get the and this is kind of abstract, right? Like perhaps it's going off the rails a little bit, but the government then allows you provisionally to do these things like drive or practice therapy.
And that's actually what happens, right? People are still being arrested in all these legalized states for selling weed.
Right.
So it's an actual thing.
Or even possession, simple possession, we're still getting arrested for.
In Colorado?
Quantity is the situation.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I mean, sure, you could say baby steps, except I don't know that this is actually a step that gets reversed. You know, once there's entrenched interests.
Well, it's social will. Like, how do we get the social will to do that? And then we can. But if there's no social will, because everybody's smoking a bunch of weed,
right?
Then
it's an uphill battle.
Right.
I mean, ideally, you pass laws that you don't have to change later, right? Like, if you're going to pass laws that are changing, that are making drug policy reform, you wouldn't want to pass things that you're going to have to backpedal on later on.
Have you talked to government people about this?
Not many directly. You know, my work is more so on the public education, community building versus actually working on. I mean, obviously, I talk to the policy advocate folks. I know the folks at Decriminalizing Nature, folks who worked on the Denver campaigns, but I'm not the one directly engaging with the lawmakers. It's a whole crazy territory right now, though, because everyone's moving these different decrim initiatives, and not everyone's really talking to each other, and it's kind of a mess right now. And that's a whole other can of worms. But
so there's a point, backing up a little bit, that we didn't totally hit. Like, we'll see resistance from people in the Decriminalized Nature world when we start talking about, you know, decriminalization of everything. Like, let's just stop decriminalizing drug users in general. You know,
hopefully not.
Like, what I see is they're like, no, these drugs are better than those drugs. And this is kind of like the Carl Hart argument in reverse. It's like the other side of it. And they're like, no, because it's nature, nature is good for you. You know, arsenic's natural, but who's counting?
I think I'm too close. Well, I'm too close to this, maybe. I mean, there might be some of that energy that's there. But I mean, hopefully, if there is a bigger groundswell to decriminalize all drugs, I would hope that folks wouldn't get in the way of that. But I think there definitely are people all around who do have the opinion that these drugs are better. And there are different risk profiles, but I think that's a different. I think the strongest case is decriminalize. The best thing for the whole movement. I mean, I guess it depends what movement you're identifying with, right? But the movement I identify with,
because in a lot of ways, this is a religious battle for a lot of people.
Sure, yeah.
Like, very literally, ayahuasca religion as a religion, and there's a lot of it in the Bay. There's a lot of it in New York. There's a lot of it all over the world. And it's absolutely a religion. You know, it doesn't have all the hallmarks. People say it's spirituality, not religion. But it's like, no, you've got a handful of dogmas here that you're not very flexible with, and perhaps flexibility is the thing we need to work towards, as opposed to, you know, following the teachings of somebody from another country. I don't want to sound like a jerk about that, but, you know, there's valid critiques there. I'm just not going to expand on it.
That's fine.
But okay, where do we want to go from here? You've got some other small projects in the works. You've got a lot of things going, honestly.
I always have a lot of things going on. I'm also working on, I'm still doing events, but moving my direction of events into, instead of events where you're looking at, you know, someone on a stage, more about connecting the people in the room. So some stuff I'm kind of building now has to do with unconference formats where people come together and, instead of watching speakers, these events are explicitly about the reason I like to go to conferences is the conversations in the hallways. It's kind of, I think, the unspoken reason everyone's going to the conferences. And so I'm working on events that explicitly focus on that. And it's not that there's no structure at all. There actually is structure. The art of that is creating the minimum amount of structure that you increase the connections. So building off of something called open space technology to facilitate that. So that's an interesting area. There's something I'm really interested in now. Basically bifurcated what I'm doing. As well as before, I was doing events that were, it was in person and it was also going online. I'm kind of now focusing for each format. So focusing on the stuff I was doing on a stage, moving that online, and then when I do gather people together, let's focus on the people in the room connecting with each other. So that's one area I'm working on. And then kind of more broadly, I think the conceptual framework that underlies everything I'm doing is, I wrote about this recently in Double Blind magazine, this concept I called PEACH, which is an acronym I made up it stands for Psychedelic Education and Community Healing. And there's a whole, if people want to see the full details on that, there was an article published in December. And the premise here is, and this is where all of my work really is stemming from, is in the education and community side of things. We have psychedelics going through FDA approvals, psilocybin and MDMA, and we've got these decriminalization happening, and that's all great, and it's not quite enough. We also need this cultural infrastructure. There's been so much emphasis on the research, but just putting these psychedelics as medicine isn't going to get us where we want to go, or at least my vision would be of where we want to go. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that psychedelics operate differently than medicine as we know it. And psychedelics, they're not just a pill that you take. It's not like an SSRI, and you're a relatively passive patient, but it's experiential by its nature. You're actually having an experience. And that implies a whole different set of preparation, integration. It's a whole different process than medicine as we know it. So it's getting integrated into a medical model that's not quite the right fit. So there needs to be this whole other layer of public education around it, and also education for providers. And one thing that's really shocking to me right now is that, and when I tell people who aren't in the psychedelic community this little tidbit, they kind of drop their jaws. It's only within the psychedelic community that people are okay with this. But part of the training to become a psychedelic therapist now, it does not include doing psychedelics.
With some organizations.
With MAPS, there is an option to do MDMA as part of the MDMA therapist training. You can take, they have this MT1 protocol. I think now they're going to make it MT2, where psychedelic MDMA therapists in training get an opportunity, not mandatory. With psilocybin, my understanding with both Compass and Usona is that there is not an opportunity for psilocybin therapists to actually receive psilocybin legally. And to me, that's just immensely problematic. How can
Why are they not looking at international options if there's like an obstruction? Do you know offhand?
It's not even about going international. I mean, MAPS figured it out with MDMA.
There's paperwork you can do to make it happen. Sure.
MAPS figured it out. They figured out a study that they're doing. They basically, the FDA is like, look, if you're going to give people MDMA, they have to go through a study. So they designed a study that they put their therapists through. Compass and Usona, I don't see any practical reason why they wouldn't do that. I think a lot of the reason has to do with scaling, actually, So you've got a company now, and it's particularly in the case of Compass, which is a for-profit company. They want to scale this, and it takes actually a lot of time and energy to give people psychedelic sessions. And so it's difficult to actually scale out the training of therapists if you're actually going to give people the psilocybin.
I think that's what George Goldsmith said at Horizons. It just wasn't like plausible.
Yeah, I asked him this question directly at Horizons, and that's pretty much what he said.
Right.
And I call bullshit on that. Like, it's not about scaling. We want quality of care. If you're scaling, if you're
a for-profit corporation beholden to your investors, first and foremost.
Yeah.
He's not here for the movement, right? Like, if he delivers 20% to 70% improvement, like, he's done his job as far as he's concerned. So he doesn't care, right?
And this is sort of I mean, this is the other piece of the issue, right? We're not gonna solve the problems of our culture by just massively distributing out psychedelics. It doesn't work like that. The psychedelics aren't a fix. They're just help us to figure out what we need to fix. And so this is actually the second piece of what I get in this article about community healing, right? We aren't just individuals in isolation that have this depression. And if we each individually take this psychedelic, we can cure our depression. Like there's the fact that we have this massive amount of depression in the culture, of trauma in the culture. It's that alone, of addiction, all these things we're talking about, it speaks to underlying systemic issues. So if the whole point of psychedelics is that we're not treating the symptoms, but we're treating the underlying causes. So on a cultural systemic level, if we're just treating individual instances of depression, trauma, etc., we've gone right back to treating the symptoms. We can use psychedelics to fix cultural systemic issues, but it's a whole different paradigm. We have to, get insight and then work cooperatively together as communities to fix the systemic structural issues. But we're not going to fix the depression epidemic by just massively distributing psilocybin. And Bennett Zellner at Horizons really nailed this, right? He showed that depression is really correlated with the wealth disparity. And so if you are distributing psychedelics and you're still exacerbating the same underlying issues, it's like you now have the problem and the solution in the same nifty package.
Mm-hmm.
It's like and it's a metaphor. I'll give a metaphor to something Michael Pollan talks about in his food writing, right? He talks about white bread with nutrients added. You took the nutrients out and then you added them back in. And that's what we have with commodified psilocybin, is white bread with nutrients added.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's true. I think, unfortunately, these big money folks aren't necessarily coming to the table with total culture change in mind. Like they're not necessarily, as part of their foundation, saying culture is like fundamentally sick. They're saying, hey, there's this drug that I can make a bunch of money off of if I organize my people and capital correctly.
Yeah.
And yes, your depression will go away for 6, 12 months, 2 years, but shit will wear off eventually. Like I had ayahuasca once and my depression went away for 9 months plus, which is great, but it came back. So like beating myself to death at a software company, that'll do it. And the commuting, the cars breaking down, like how toxic, like cars are amazing, but cars are also a huge drag on individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah, I think about all the inner work I've done over the years. It's like still within these systems, it's like the culture and communities are sick. And no matter how much healing I do, you still come back to a sick environment. Yeah. And how much change can you really do if you're just individually healing, right? You might feel great for a little bit, but then you come back to an environment that's not fostering growth and not changing. And this is why I don't think sometimes psychedelics are going to save the world, because we're not invested in huge cultural or systemic changes. We'd really have to fix different parts of capitalism and consumer culture to really shift things. I don't know. That's just my opinion or the way I view it, because why do we have depression to begin with, right?
Yep.
Why do we have these mental illnesses to begin with?
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is I think this is one of the bigger problems that we're facing right now as a community. And now that psychedelics are this really hot subject, there's so many players entering into the scene who are not rooted in the community, who don't know what they're talking about. They just see opportunity and they're hopping in. Not necessarily everybody. There's certainly people who are new to the scene who are in it for the right intentions, but there's also a lot of people that are entering now because of the opportunity. And it's really there's people that are organizing psychedelic conferences now who literally have never done a psychedelic, and organizing conferences on business opportunities and psychedelics, and this is a really big issue. If there are people who don't understand the field, don't understand what's going on here, and are just jumping in, throwing a lot of money at this and create, I'm getting AI generated emails now from new psychedelic therapy centers. It's that, and you just read them, I'm like, ooh, what is this?
Well, some of my concern is too, like, maybe you guys can agree how weird psychedelics are sometimes and how weird the experience could be. And like, people that are trying to create these new systems don't have any idea about what these experiences can actually do to people. And I think being really honest about some of our own really challenging experiences have really informed me on like, wow, like, maybe this isn't good for everybody. I just had somebody mention something to me about one of their like a teenager, a friend, their son's or daughter's friend took mushrooms and jumped out the window. And it's like, some of these things are rare and we understand that. But I don't know what's like the weirdness that comes up in this. And if we're just creating these sterile containers thinking this is a drug, it's going to fix your depression. But what about all the weird existential or spiritual type of experiences that come up, and you're facilitating these experiences where you're talking to DMT elves and then all of a sudden you have no idea how to go back to the world. I mean, I don't know. These are the things I think about because I think it's some of the things that I've been through, and especially after my near-death experience, coming back and be like, what the hell are we doing here? That in itself was probably the most psychedelic experience I had, and I had a hard time reintegrating back into daily life. And I don't know. That's why I think like we need systems and we need to understand what we're actually doing here. Besides, we're going to just create these systems because everybody needs psychedelics to heal. It's like, well, if the system's broken, it's not really going to work that well. We're going to have a lot of people open up and have cool experiences. And who knows, maybe a lot of people having these experiences gets turned on for changing the system. And I think that's like, we need to kind of bind together to be able to change the system and collaborate.
I think the key word in everything you're saying there is experience. And like, I think this needs to be emphasized more, that we're talking about something that is an experience. And the fact that you've been there, that's how you know this. That's how you can identify this. And this is why it's so important. Like, how can you guide someone through an experience that you haven't had yourself? You can't teach someone to scuba dive if you've never strapped on a tank. And I think that, I've been trying to think about like where's the gap here in understanding, and I think, I don't know, the way I engage, and I was thinking about this, maybe this framing is controversial, so I'm trying to think of like words I can use that are better. But spiritual, right? And when I say spiritual, I don't necessarily imply a certain cosmology, but spiritual at its root being relationship to self, relationship to the world around me, right? And so a psychedelic experience, by that definition of spirituality, right? To me, it's intrinsically spiritual. And so how can you guide someone on a spiritual process if you haven't got, through spiritual practices that you haven't done? And I think it's this denial, the sterilization of psychedelic experience as something not spiritual, as medicine, as that is where we're losing this. And somehow it's being justified that it's like, it's okay. You don't need to have that experience. You can just, this is just, this is a medicine, it's a therapy method. I don't have to have that experience to sit with someone who's had it. And in the case of like, you're working at Zendo or something, right? And someone comes in and they're in a bad way, and maybe they're on a substance you haven't done, and you do your best to sit for them. Like, that's one thing. But if you're, as a professional, inducing a state intentionally and guiding someone through a process, to me, that's completely unethical to guide someone through a spiritual process that you haven't been through yourself. And I would like that to just be like, can we acknowledge that this is a spiritual experience?
It's tough, right? Like, everything is a spiritual experience if we want to go there. But
sure, yeah.
You and I spent a lot of time chatting about this issue at Horizons. And I've sat with it for quite a while. And maybe the crux of it is like, how do you convince corporations and or federal regulators that this is important?
And maybe it's a word. The word spiritual, there's an allergy to it. So maybe it's like not the right word. Like, what's the word that we can use there? And I don't know what it is. If someone has a suggestion out there for a different word we can use that's not as triggering.
Perhaps though, like to use their own, the corporate world against them a little bit, like the market should prove that things are better than other things, like A is better than B, and perhaps the data will speak for itself. Like, you know, if Compass has worse results than some nonprofit or other
if
company.
We're asking the right questions though, right? Because I mean, yes, I do think that the efficacy will be more for people, you know, if you have guys that have done the psychedelic, and I think that research is coming.
It's always about asking better questions, right?
Yeah, but I don't know if the right
what
question,
are you thinking?
Well, yeah, I don't know if the question is efficacy in terms of treating this kind of, you know, arbitrary set of symptoms that we call it a disease. I think there's better, I don't know what the questions are, actually.
Right. Right. And that's, you know, that's why we need to keep talking about this. And like, eventually we'll have that spark. You know, maybe someday we'll all be in Portugal or Burning Man on acid. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
And hopefully we remember. But like, yeah, that's the trick. Like, how do we come up with a solution to this problem and then put it in front of people, like educate people, you know, more fully. But I think, you know, us unpacking this and you kind of like giving your spin is going to really help a lot of the listeners understand it.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm putting this out there as open questions I have. So, I mean, I hope that some people get an idea listening to this conversation. And these are really, I think these are the most interesting and most important questions right now.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of want to backtrack a little bit on my comment. Like, you know, we wouldn't be doing this project if we didn't believe in psychedelics, right? And the healing potential. And I got into this because I really wanted to, I mean, you know, years and years ago, wanted to go to school to become a psychedelic therapist when I didn't think this would ever be a job. And I do believe in the healing power of all of that. But it's been interesting to self-reflect and just sit with it as these bigger companies are coming on board and seeing kind of like how they're approaching it and just kind of seeing like, ooh, wow, is this really going to change, or could it really like exacerbate things a little bit more because it's still within the confines of a sick like community or a sick system, you know? And I think that's what has really brought it up for me over the years of like having these really profoundly deep healing experiences and then seeing like the system come in and swoop in and want to take advantage of it and be like, is that actually gonna, I get it, like accessibility, I think it's huge, right? Being able to expand, scale, offer these experiences and have clinics for people to do the healing work. But yeah, I don't know. I guess more hooked on the systemic things of like, we need some sort of system override. And I don't know, if we're just constantly consuming and caught up in this consumer driven mentality, is it sustainable long-term? I don't know.
You raise an awesome point, right? So psychedelics, as you know, Stan Grof has said, right, they're non-specific amplifiers of experience. That applies on the individual and on the cultural level. So if we're trying to scale psychedelic therapy, right, they're not going to fix us. They're going to amplify whatever is actually happening. And maybe having our own reflection come back at us will, in the long run, you know, a difficult experience can be healing. So if we as a culture are ready to look at ourselves, sure, that could be healing, but it's not going to be healing in the way that I think most people think it's going to be. It's going to amplify, and we're going to see exactly what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's going on right now. You know, we're in our own community, we're getting we have an amplified conversation around all the stuff that is affecting the broader community in the broader world.
It's complex. It's complex. I mean, I think we probably all kind of sit with this every day.
No, it's easy. Just everyone take acid and we'll be fixed. We'll all get enlightened. Like, it's so easy. Just spread more psilocybin around the world and we'll all won't have any more depression.
Right. So a thing that I've been noticing is we have this like new language calling these issues like systemic problems. And you know, this is stuff that we've had cultural leaders critiquing for a long time. Like, you know, Wadsworth, the Beats, Tim Leary. In the 60s there was this big utopian impulse, so people started communes so they didn't have to interact as much with a sick culture. You know, perhaps that was part of the reason why the Quakers and the Amish did their thing, separating from culture and, you know, new stuff and fashion. And, you know, like, what if we just focused on what was essential for us and, you know, expressed humanity in ways that culture didn't necessarily endorse, you know? Like when I was doing a ton of organizing way back for like Reality Sandwich and Evolver in Boston, like my regular line was, we're looking at nothing. I'm working towards nothing less than total systems change. Like we need everything everything needs a revolution, from pharma to eco to climate to government. Like, you know, the fact that a lot of this stuff has persisted for many decades is an indication of how sick and cancerous our situation is. And this is in a post 9/11 world where everything was very amplified, you know, and right around the time of the financial collapse. So obviously the financial system was, you know, a target, and mental health care with psychedelics, where all that data was kind of coming online. And a lot of people decided, like, let's do communes, or let's just do group living, or, you know, I think there's a lot more revolutions coming. Like it's probably not that far out to think of like, you know, a small solution being like weird group marriages, like 10 people marry each other and then they're a family unit. And that way, like I
think that kind of thing's happening in the Bay already.
Absolutely is. Yeah. Like I've seen it in like sci-fi like 10 years ago, and I'm like, this isn't really sci-fi. This is actually happening.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So like, you know, yeah, people just need different ways of organizing so that they can have a different experience of being alive. And, you know, like you can yell about Trump or Bernie or whoever, or, you know, George Goldsmith, or, you know, criminal du jour, or like psychedelic villain du jour. But what are you really doing? You know, you're just playing into this kind of like BuzzFeed landscape sometimes. You know, maybe you're doing something great, but are you?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really important point, right? Is it's not enough just to point out the villains, let's say, but, you know, what are the constructive things, you know? I'm really fond of the Buckminster Fuller quote. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete.
Right.
And this is really consistent with, you know, so I'm currently reading Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown, and it's very much aligned with that. And it's very much about, you know, okay, everything's fractal. So like, how do I embody the things I want to see change in the world? And so how do we as a psychedelic community embody the changes we want to see in the broader world? And I think we have to actually we have to do the work ourselves, and we have to really keep asking those questions and keep trying to embody the thing we want to see.
Right. And I always come back to like, what sacrifices are you willing to make to really embody some of that stuff? Right. Because sometimes that takes our own sacrifices. I remember listening to a podcast of somebody talking about like, you know, fossil fuels and climate change. And they're like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't fly around the world, but I'm not going to stop doing that. And it's like, if we do believe in, you know, consuming fossil fuels and flying and driving is leading to climate change, then are we all willing to sacrifice not doing that? Right. Most of the time people still want to go on vacation. They want to do things and, you know, fly around to get their message around. But it's like, what do you actually believe, and how can you live that? And I think sometimes we don't always follow through because we're not willing to actually make that sacrifice. Maybe because we're hesitant about that actual belief.
Right. It's hard. And like, you know, I can, and myself included in that category, like I live in the Bay Area. I have family in Baltimore, who I love, and I go back with some frequency to see them. And so does flying coast to coast, you know, what's my impact there? And what is a practical thing I can do? You know, and how do I balance between, okay, the impact of these flights versus like the values of seeing family and relationships? And tough question to answer, actually.
They're very, I don't have any answers to it. Things to think about, though.
My permaculture teacher, Larry Santoyo, he's like out at Los Angeles, really interesting guy. He had this line once, like, let's worry less about our footprint and more about our handprint. Right? So, you know, as I say that, like, low-hanging fruit, like carbon credits for flights are incredibly cheap. I know it's not a perfect system, but at least somebody's planting trees to offset your situation, right? So, you know, there's low-hanging fruit, but there's also big fruit. Like, you know, planes require a lot of rare earth minerals that then push on slavery and blah, 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 plus the whole disgusting oil industry.
Same with these things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cell phones.
So, like, how do we somehow work towards transcending like the smaller impact of that and working towards a larger end of like a more peaceful, transformed planet.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I think it's important at least to be asking these kind of questions.
Yeah.
You know, at the minimum, like, okay, and bringing more awareness into it and starting a process. And it's not going to happen overnight.
Right. And where has this been done well in the past? Like, I don't want to say this is the same as like the civil rights crisis way back in the States, like the 60s, and, you know, segregation, separate water fountains and bathrooms, all that craziness. Like, I don't want to say it's the same as that, but maybe there's models from like the civil rights movement or like Britta Love and the sex rights movement where we can learn a lot. Oh, a line that Britta said to us at one point when we were eating tacos, Britta Love.
Yeah.
I have to remind myself, the revolution will be embodied. And it's back to your point where you said, like, how do we embody this stuff? And embody the culture that we want to see.
Yeah, be the change.
Right. And, you know, there's models like Burning Man's not perfect, but like the founding principles of Burning Man are pretty freaking cool.
Yeah.
And like radical inclusivity and radical participation, gift economy. Like, you know, if you can organize yourself into like appropriate pods of some kind, like perhaps there's something beautiful on the other side of that.
I mean, I think the premise of the gift economy is amazing. You know, the first time I went to Burning Man, and this is, you know, circling back to my story in the beginning, right after I quit my corporate job, you know, I went to Burning Man before my one-way flight to India, and it was my springboard. And so here I am at Burning Man, and you know, in this very pivotal moment in my life, completely changing everything. And I have my mind blown. But more than anything else, it might, you know, more than the flashy lights and amazing art cars, which are great, was I think the culture was the most impactful thing, the gift economy. It was this vision of a future where, you know, yeah, everyone is gifting everything. It's not a transactional thing. You give a gift. And I think there's a misunderstanding out there too, that Burning Man's a barter economy. It's not a barter economy. It's a gift economy. People give gifts with no expectation of anything in return. So and it's a beautiful vision of a world where people who are giving freely, and everything we need is also being given. And, you know, if we're far from it, I think, or you know, maybe we're not that far from it in some other way. It's really just you know, an idea away, a massively adopted idea, but it's a beautiful vision of a world like that wasn't based on having to withhold things, or, you know, we have an economy based on, you know, it's not based on value creation. It's based on wealth extraction. It's how do I prevent people, and how do I extract by keeping a claim on a certain thing that I own and holding it back. But what if we had a world where everyone, instead of trying to extract value, was actually just trying to create value?
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful vision.
There's some, unfortunately, I think my computer stopped recording at 3 minutes ago.
Oh,
which is awful timing.
Well, at least Zoom has a backup.
Yeah, cool. So we can go for a minute longer if you want, or we can just kind of. Actually, can we just pause while I try to fix this thing real quick?
Okay.
All right. Well, we had a little bit of technical difficulties, and we are about at an hour. So, we'll start wrapping up here. So, Mike, I don't know, anything that you want to touch on about this recent conversation that we just had? Any closing thoughts that you might be having? And it's definitely a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, man, we covered a lot of ground here. I would just encourage everyone to, you know, there's so much focus on research, and I would just encourage more thought into the importance of the cultural infrastructure we need to maturely bring psychedelics in, education, community, all of that. And my work's at Psychedelic Seminars, psychsems.com, PSYCHSEMS. And if you like what you see there and you want to help to create more of that, any help is welcome at Patreon, patreon.com/psychsems, patreon.com/psychsems.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to see what unfolds for you and the lines of interviews that you have lined up. So yeah, I'm pumped.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what happens too. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
our pleasure. And hope we get to spend some more time together soon.
Yeah,
let's get
definitely.
you to Denver.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I might be in your neighborhood in a few months, actually. So I'll hit you up.
Outstanding. All right, Mike, thanks again for your time. And until the next time we see you, take care.
Cool. See ya.